When my mother remarried, I never imagined sharing a house with someone like Adam. He was my stepbrother by law, older than me by 5 years, but standing at just 4 feet tall, with a presence that often felt more innocent than mature. His mind, too, had been locked in the simplicity of childhood, never quite catching up to his age. Living together blurred boundaries, not because of anything either of us did intentionally at first, but because proximity has a way of pulling people into places they never meant to go. Adam adored routine. Every evening after dinner, he'd settle on the couch with his favorite blanket, waiting for me to join him. He liked old cartoons and anything with bright colors, and he'd laugh loudly at jokes that didn't quite make sense. It was sweet and safe, or so I thought. The first time he asked if I would lay next to him, I didn't hesitate. It felt like humoring a little brother who hated being alone. His hand tugged at my wrist gently, his wide eyes expectant, and I couldn't say no. We stayed like that for hours, the TV flickering across the dim living room, and eventually we both drifted off. Nothing happened. Nothing was supposed to happen. But over the months things shifted. Not between us openly, never with words, but in the undercurrent of those quiet nights. Sometimes I'd catch him watching me from the corner of his eye, gaze lingering just a moment too long. Other times, he'd scoot closer until our shoulders touched, his body pressing against mine like a child seeking warmth, though the heat beneath his skin felt heavier than that. I told myself it was innocent, that he was innocent, and then one evening I saw it. I'd come downstairs in shorts and a loose shirt, expecting the usual. Him curled up in his blanket, waiting for me to cue up the next episode of whatever show he was fixated on that week. But when I walked in, he was standing in the middle of the room, adjusting himself. His face blank as if what he was doing meant nothing at all. My gaze dropped before I could stop it, and that's when I noticed the impossible. I looked away so fast I felt dizzy. 13.5 inches. I wasn't sure how or why I noticed the detail so precisely. Maybe it was the shock. Maybe it was disbelief etching itself into something measurable so my brain could process it. I felt wrong for even looking, worse for thinking about it afterward. But the image stayed with me even when I wanted it gone. After that night, something inside me shifted, quietly but undeniably. I became hyper-aware of him. How close he sat. How often he wanted to share a blanket. How, every time we said goodnight, his hugs lingered just a little longer than they should have. And worse than all of that was how my body noticed things I wished it wouldn't. One night, not long after, I woke up to find him in my doorway. "It's raining," he whispered, his voice small. "Can I stay here? Just for a bit?" Lightning flared outside the window, throwing his silhouette into sharp relief. I should have told him no. I should have reminded him that he was old enough to sleep through a storm. But instead, I lifted the covers and scooted over, making space without a word. He climbed in beside me, curling up like a child seeking safety. His head barely reached my shoulder. I could feel the rhythm of his breath slowing as he relaxed, as though just being near me was enough to quiet whatever fears the storm had stirred up. I told myself this was harmless, that it was just for tonight. But as the minutes stretched on, I couldn't sleep. Not with him so close. Not with the memory of what I'd seen resurfacing, uninvited. I shifted slightly, trying to find comfort, but the movement caused him to stir. He nuzzled against me without thinking, his arm draping across my waist like it belonged there. I held my breath. It was supposed to be nothing, just a scared boy needing comfort. But as the rain tapped against the window, and his fingers twitched absent-mindedly against my hip, I realized I wasn't afraid of the storm outside. I was afraid of this quiet, creeping moment between us, of what it might become if neither of us pulled away. I stayed still, my heart pounding, the night stretching endlessly around us. And then, as if sensing my unease, Adam murmured, "Do you feel safe now?" I almost laughed at the question, not because it was funny, but because I wasn't sure which of us he meant. Yeah, I whispered back. Safe. 'Twas a lie. And I think part of me hoped he couldn't tell. The rain kept falling. He drifted off to sleep, his breath steady and calm. But I stayed awake, staring at the ceiling, asking myself questions I couldn't answer. Like why I hadn't sent him back to his room. Why I hadn't set a boundary. Why I suddenly noticed how warm his body was pressed against mine. And why part of me didn't want to move at all. By morning I told myself it was just one night. Fleeting moment. Something I'd forget. But deep down I knew better. Some lines, once crossed, even in silence, are impossible to redraw. And this felt like the first step toward something I wasn't sure either of us could ever take back. It wasn't supposed to happen again. That's what I told myself each morning after that night. I'd wake up, replay the way Adam had curled into me like I was some kind of shelter, and vow to keep my distance. But vows are easy in daylight. It's the night that tests them. A week later, another storm rolled in. The sky darkened early, the air thick and damp. I spent most of the evening pacing between rooms, avoiding him, hoping that if I stayed scarce, he'd fall asleep on his own. But just past midnight there was a soft knock at my door. I didn't answer right away. Maybe if I stayed silent, he'd give up. But after a moment, his voice came, barely above a whisper. "It's really loud," he said. "Please." Against better judgment I opened the door. And there he stood. Small, barefoot, wrapped in that worn-out blanket he never slept without. His eyes were wide, pleading, but there was something else there too. Something unspoken that neither of us dared name. "You can stay," I said quietly. "Just for tonight." He smiled, the kind of smile that made him look years younger, and followed me to the bed. We lay side by side in the dark. I kept my body rigid, arms pinned to my sides, staring up at the ceiling like if I focused hard enough, I could will myself to become part of it. For a while it worked. We listened to the rain, to the occasional rumble of thunder, to the soft creak of the house settling around us. Then Adam shifted. Slowly, deliberately. One of his hands found my waist under the blanket, fingers curling there like he was holding onto the edge of a cliff. I stiffened, heart pounding so loudly I thought he might hear it. "It's okay, right?" he asked. I didn't answer. Not because I didn't have one, but because I wasn't sure which was worse. Telling him no and breaking whatever fragile thing had been building between us, or saying yes and admitting that I wanted this too. He must have taken my silence as permission. His hand moved again, sliding higher this time, fingertips grazing the hem of my shirt. It wasn't innocent anymore. We both knew that. "Adam," I whispered, meaning for it to sound like a warning. But it came out softer than I intended, closer to an invitation. He turned toward me, pressing his small frame against mine. I felt the heat of him everywhere we touched. And then, without asking, he nuzzled into the curve of my neck, his breath warm and uneven. "Why does my body feel like this when I'm near you?" he asked, his voice as honest as a confession. "It feels weird, but good." I swallowed hard, searching for words that might make sense of something that should never have started. But nothing I could say would explain why my own body answered his in kind. Why, instead of pulling away, I shifted closer. Why I let his wandering hands linger. "You're growing up," I managed, though the words felt hollow. "Sometimes bodies, they react." He nodded against my neck like he understood, but I knew better. His understanding wasn't intellectual, it was physical, instinctual, and we were already too far into it to stop now. One of his legs hooked over mine, anchoring me in place. Then, almost shyly, he asked, "Can I touch you?" It should have been the moment I said no. The moment I reminded him and myself of all the reasons we couldn't cross this line. But I didn't. Instead, I guided his hand beneath the fabric of my shirt, placing it gently over my ribs, where my heart thudded wildly against his palm. He smiled at that like he'd just discovered some hidden treasure. We stayed that way for a while, neither of us speaking. His hand moved with slow curiosity, mapping the shape of me like he was learning the world for the first time. Every breath I took felt dangerous, every glance down at him a silent acknowledgement of how far we'd fallen. And still I didn't stop him. Minutes passed, or maybe it was hours. Time didn't feel real in that room, wrapped in shadows and secrets. Eventually he kissed my shoulder, his lips soft and hesitant. "I like being here with you," he said. "I feel safe." "Do you?" It was the same word from the first night. But now it meant something else entirely. I wasn't sure if safety was even possible anymore. Not after this. And yet, wrapped in his arms, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing against my skin, I wanted to believe it. "Yeah," I whispered. "I do." And I meant it. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about what was right or wrong. I wasn't thinking about tomorrow or the next storm. I was thinking only of that moment, of the warmth beside me, the hands that hadn't yet learned restraint, and the undeniable truth that I'd crossed a line I couldn't uncross. As the rain continued to fall outside, Adam curled tighter against me, already drifting to sleep. But I stayed awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering where this left us. Wondering how much further we could go before something broke that couldn't be repaired. And, worse yet, wondering if part of me wanted to break it. Because once you've felt the weight of forbidden desire, pretending you can carry it like nothing's changed is the biggest lie of all. And in that quiet, dark room, I realized I wasn't ready to stop lying. The days that followed unfolded like waking from a dream I wasn't sure I wanted to leave. Adam moved through the house as if nothing had changed. His simple smile, his careless humming, the way he trailed behind me from room to room, all of it remained the same. But I wasn't the same. Because I remembered every second of that night. And I noticed everything now. The brush of his hand when passing me a plate. How his gaze lingered too long whenever I adjusted my clothes. The innocent questions that weren't quite innocent anymore. I told myself to create distance, to reset the boundary I'd so willingly erased. I stopped watching TV with him at night. I made excuses to stay in my room. But Adam didn't understand avoidance. He sought me out unaware, or perhaps uncaring, of the weight of what we'd done. One afternoon, while the house sat in heavy silence, he appeared in my doorway. "Why don't you hang out with me anymore?" he asked. "Did I do something bad?" I looked up from the book I hadn't been reading, guilt gnawing at the edges of me. His expression was so sincere. There wasn't calculation in his words, no malice. Just confusion. Child's confusion. "No," I said softly. "You didn't do anything wrong." But that wasn't true. We both had. Adam padded into the room. His blanket clutched in his hands, trailing on the floor like a shadow. He climbed onto the bed without waiting for permission, resting his head on my lap as though we'd never broken any unspoken rules. "I liked when we were close," he murmured. "It felt nice. You make me feel good. Warm." I ran my fingers through his hair without thinking. Habit. Reflex. A gesture that once meant comfort now tangled with something I couldn't name out loud. "This is dangerous," I whispered, mostly to myself. He looked up at me. Why? And how could I explain it to him? How could I describe the weight of guilt and desire, the gnawing conflict of knowing better and still wanting more? Before I could answer, he sat up, facing me directly. His small frame felt out of place with the gravity between us. Yet when he reached for my hand, there was nothing small about the intention. "Can I stay with you again tonight?" It should have been an easy no. But instead I found myself nodding. Yes. That night the storm was inside me, not outside the window. He crawled into bed beside me as if the previous nights were practice runs for this one. There was no hesitation this time. No timid brushes of fingertips or accidental touches. His hands found me in the dark, bolder now. Confident in the knowledge that I wouldn't pull away. And I didn't. I let it happen because I wanted it to happen. And as awful as that truth was, it felt like honesty. We moved together like people trying to figure out a language neither of us had learned. His hands explored and I guided them. His questions were fewer now, replaced by instinct, by need. And all I kept thinking was that I should have stopped it before it started. But desire makes liars of us all. When it was over, the silence pressed down on me heavier than the night itself. Adam drifted to sleep with the ease of someone who had no idea the world might judge him. But I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, counting the ways this could never be undone. I thought about the version of myself from before Adam moved into this house. The version that never would have imagined finding comfort in moments like these. The version that believed some lines simply couldn't be crossed. She felt like a stranger now. In the morning, I made coffee I wouldn't drink and stared out the kitchen window at nothing in particular. The house felt too still. Adam appeared behind me, rubbing sleep from his eyes. His blanket dragging along the floor like always. He wrapped his arms around my waist from behind. "Can we do that again tonight?" he asked, his voice muffled against my back. And there it was, the question I knew would come, innocent in his mouth but catastrophic in its meaning. I covered his hands with mine and took a breath I didn't know how to release. "Maybe not tonight," I said. But the truth sat in my throat. It wasn't a no. It never had been. I turned to face him, and for a brief moment, I wondered if this was how it would always be now. A secret wrapped inside soft blankets and silent rooms. Hidden from the world but burning just beneath the surface. We stood like that for a long time. Just the two of us. And somewhere deep down, I knew we had already passed the point where endings could be clean. Because after you cross a line, all that's left is how far you're willing to go before you finally stop pretending it isn't happening. And I wasn't sure I wanted to stop at all.